The site itself was picked out by Bienville when he established the city to be the place where the church and worship would happen.
Monks were needed to be fed.
Every parcel in New Orleans was given to colonists to create a house and to create a garden. They need garden to eat, not to have flowers.
Always there was a garden attached to the cathedral. The site where the rectory is now was the site of a garden that went from behind the presbytere all the way to Royal Street into St. Anne Street. This was a garden.
The Capuchin Garden is over on the St. Anne Street side, not in the middle where Place St. Antoine is today.
The garden of the Capuchin Priest was located between St. Anne Street and something like 10 meters in the actual garden, Antony's Garden. All this situated in this part of the street. This was their garden.
In the 18th century, the Capuchin monks had quite a bit of potager, a vegetable garden there for themselves.
The purpose of a vegetable being planted and grown is to end on a plate.
The Capuchins, they began to plant some potatoes, some vegetables, and build a house for themselves. You see where is a banana tree here. The first house of the priest was just after this banana tree. It is the corner of the cathedral now.
They had a hut on the site. In the early time, they said Mass in the warehouse. The city was just, a few huts together. But by the early 1720s, which was within 5 years of the founding of the city, a primitive structure was built, and then finally by the end of the 1720s, a permanent structure was built, which was the predecessor to the present building.
At that time, the Capuchins, they need money, so they sell also their vegetables and fruits to other people.
We know what plants, what seeds were sent from France to the colony for planting.
Some scientists were sent to Louisiana to find plants from America, but also plants coming from France and given to colonial Louisiana to make tests.
In France, we have been very keen on American plants, and most of the American introductions to France are exactly of the period where the first church was built.
There was quite no difference between the garden in 1730 and 1780. It was a square garden with basin in the center to conserve the water, and there was fruit trees, olive trees all around each of the 4 quarters.
Plenty of introductions are not really related to what was France, but to what was already introduced to France.
Quite from the beginning of New Orleans, some of Asian plants arrived here.
Like the orange trees, which are growing quite well here.
One particular map called the Garnachon map had plans for 12 or 14 gardens in the French Quarter during the French colonial period.
The Ursulines had a major garden. De Montigny had a lovely garden. Bienville had a garden. And 2 major gardens on Chartres Street between Bienville and Cantaille.
Not that much is really known about the garden during the Spanish period.
The French made lots and lots of plans, and they made diagrams of the layout inside given lots. But the Spanish didn't do that. They just drew blank squares, so you don't know what's on the square.
Père Antoine, Antonio de Sedello, had a little hut that he lived in the garden of the cathedral.
And we can see that garden on some old engraving or photographies. And it was truly a garden at that period. It was the first garden, Antoine, as it can be considered now.
In the Great Fire of 1788, the parish church was destroyed and a new church needed to be built.
Famous Father Antoine, who was a Spanish, and had the idea to rent the garden parcel by parcel to get money to restore destroyed houses of the priests. Because of the Great Fire, nobody has a garden in the city. People need gardens. The garden completely changed Every person who rents a lot can plant what he wants.
Orleans Street went all the way through to about the middle of the present garden. And there were houses actually on either side of that, and the alleys were much smaller.
Orleans Street at that period began just in the rear of the church.
Rue d'Orléans enters the square, divides it in half.
And Orleans Street is the very axis of the original city because it is a central street of the city. And the city is divided in two parts, each side of Orleans Street.
Now, Père Antoine died in 1829.
When the municipality wanted to create first the Place Antoine and secondly the garden, they must buy a part of this land, the north part.
The cathedral has always been a gathering place. And where there's a gathering place, you try to have as much aesthetic beauty as well. And remember, when you had a small community such as New Orleans, we had to be able to have a place.
The idea of a public garden was very common in New Orleans in the middle 19th century.
The municipality of the Vieux-Carré transformed Anthony's Garden in a city place called Place Antoine, Antoine's Place. And it wasn't a garden, just a square but without trees.
Place Saint-Antoine was a public square. It wasn't owned and fenced by the church for several decades.
The reason why they wanted to transform it into a garden was only to rent it to a person who sells ice and another person who wants to put here a coffee shop and a lemonade with a part outside and a part inside. And there was a plantation of magnolia trees all around this space. So it was a garden, if we can say.
It had a flower market. We think it had orangerie. It had private lessors who sold ice cream and sweets and had this opened on, quote, the season around the 1st of May and operated a little amusement area in there, and it was a public place.
It was the center of town. Everybody would go to the one church in the city for the most part. And as the surrounding area began to develop, it was logical for a park to form behind the church because here you had another gathering place. Prior to the 1830s, most people in New Orleans were within walking distance of that very central portion of the city. And its main business district was just off to the side of it, just upriver for the next 4 or 5 blocks along Royal and Charter Street. It was the CBD of New Orleans in its earliest days. You also had theaters nearby. The garden was just half a block away from the Théâtre d'Orléans, which was the main theater in New Orleans for many years. It was the main Creole gathering place. And it was the place to meet. I'll meet you at the square. I'll meet you at the garden behind the cathedral. For so long, that was the most convenient place to meet and be seen, since it was a promenade as well. Even today, it's a commercial site because the garden has stores surrounding it. There are artists who hang their paintings on the fences and sell them. So it continues to be a very important commercial focal point in New Orleans today.
So the landlord was the city of New Orleans. In the 1830s, the city executed a complicated land swap.
The city deeded to the cathedral that property, that's today the garden, and took from the cathedral part of the land that we see building the 2 alleyways.
Alleys put through from Charters to Royal on each side of what is now the square. And the church, or the wardens of the cathedral, got a little place behind it, which was called Place Saint-Antoine.
We don't know much of the southern part, where is now Pirates Alley. We know much more of the northern part, Father Antoine Alley.
In 1845, when they were redoing the present cathedral, it was decided to lengthen the cathedral. So the present St. Anthony's Garden that we see now, with the iron fence that matches Jackson Square, was put up in 1845.
That fence put limitations on the size of the garden and the shape, the perimeter of the garden. And it hasn't changed since then because the fence is still there.
Through the sketches we have through the years, it was a very different type of garden at different eras. We have some sketches in the 1870s that show a fountain.
And there's a wonderful 1887 lithograph which shows mature plantings. and the remains of a tonnelle. A tonnelle is a favorite feature in French gardens, the little arbor, and they would put grapevine or even a tomato on it, or they would put hyacinth bean. Lulève in the Nouveau Jardinier recommends various flowering vines for the tonnelle, little tunnel, an arbor. There were wiggly walkways, there was a fountain, there was small-scale plantings lining the walkways. So even though it was kind of overgrown and there were some mature trees, it did not have grass in the middle. And it did kind of have that Parisian look to it that Jackson Square has, for goodness sakes. I mean, where we have walkways and beds and not a central grassy area, which is very, very Anglo.
We're used in New Orleans now to seeing tropical gardens and all the patios. But tropical gardens did not become popular in New Orleans until around 1890s. Prior to that, it was the formal French garden. Walkways, citrus trees, and some indigenous plants as well. But not this lush with banana and palm, etc. That didn't come in until about the 1890s.
It got overgrown after the Civil War, and it became impossible to keep up.
By the beginning of the 20th century, the cathedral began to go into quite a state of disrepair. Then there was a major hurricane that inflicted even more damage on the cathedral. So with that, practically anything that would have been surviving from the 19th century was most likely destroyed.
And people began to rely on the old standby, the oak tree, the azalea, the camellia, the reliable flowering shrubs that took almost no care compared to flowering plants. And those assumptions about grass and oak trees and shady, lush tropical plants, blooming in due season once a year, but with no maintenance, those assumptions were so ingrained that it was considered beautiful. It was the Southern thing to do. It wasn't the French thing to do. It wasn't the New Orleans thing to do. It was the Southern thing to do.
The rear of the cathedral is a beautiful sight to see. In the evening, for instance, you have the magnificent statue of the Sacred Heart, which was put here early 20th century, with a light that shines on it that gives a shadow across the back of the cathedral.
The large statue of the Sacred Heart was placed as a memorial to a family in the garden.
There is 4 tombs and also the monument to the French sailors who died of the yellow fever.
In the 1950s, there was a revision of the landscape that we do know of, and what is there now was put in then.
The landscaping done in the 1980s was more of a beautification project and probably didn't have any historical basis for it.
Katrina gave us tabula rasa at the St. Louis Cathedral Garden. The oak and the magnolia were blown down, ripped up.
With the destruction of Katrina, the current rector had nothing to do but to address the issues in the garden. First, the cathedral held a fundraiser to gather a certain amount of funds to begin the project.
We have got some $60,000 from individuals for this garden specifically, who look and see and have a feeling for the beauty, the history, and I'm very grateful for them because that's what makes this project not our project. I look at it more as a project for the city.
At the same time, the Getty Foundation put aside money to help New Orleans nonprofits do some redevelopment projects post-Katrina, and I was lucky enough to be invited to be on the committee to try to decide what to do with the garden.
In restoring the garden, do we want to take a particular era and make it that way? And why do we want to do that? Or do we want to give an example of what the history has been since there has been a garden?
The one thing I can say that I do know is what is there now is not the most significant thing for that garden.
I approached Gilles-Antoine Langlois. He holds 2 doctorates, one in urban planning and one in Louisiana history. I asked him to write a letter to the rector of the cathedral explaining the the types of gardens that could have been at the cathedral originally.
I remember the Getty Foundation and the Archbishop asked me which is the period of reference of this garden. There is 3 main periods for the garden, and I think the landscape architect must make a combination of that in a new project, in a new style, you know.
The letter was very well received. Gilles was able to pinpoint, I believe, 12 or 14 very specific types of gardens that were used in the French period in New Orleans. The next step was to find an appropriate landscape architect. I contacted Gilles again. He recommended Louis Benesch. Louis Benesch is a French landscape architect. He was involved in the restoration of the Tuileries, and he's been really a leader in capturing the spirit of historic gardens within current-day reality.
What will be important will be the use of the space. I would prefer to have another natural evolution than just trying to copy. It's quite difficult to choose what is the most significant time of such a place.
The garden is the green space here in the quarter, one of the few. What do we want to do here? And I don't know that we can make that determination until we do the study.
One dream, but it is only a dream, could be to open it every day to the public. It is a very small garden, so it could be destroyed in a few years by too many people.
So how do we apply the public nature of the garden behind the cathedral to the values that we identify in over the years that that garden has been there?
I'd like to open the garden more to civic events, church events, etc., from all over, for people who want to have things there. So this is what we try to do.
I'm also, of course, waiting for the work of the archaeologist who is going to start tomorrow.
In all the parts of this small piece of land, there is something to find out.
What we want to do is bore different spaces in the garden where some of the sketches will show us things happen so that they can look and determine what was in there and what was not in there.
We never know what they will find, but generally speaking, when we are talking about garden archaeology, they are trying to find layers of previous paths, through pollens and roots of the plants which have been planted.
We've assembled an archaeological team headed by Shannon Doughty of the University of Chicago.
I guess it's a 3-prong approach. One is to just get an overall snapshot with the small shovel tests of what's going on everywhere, and the trenching will kind of do that too. Objective number 2 is to really explore the area that we know least about, where the archaeology can contribute to the history the most, which is the French colonial period. And then thirdly, to randomly place small units for the botanical samples for the 19th century plantings.
The tombs won't be disturbed during the excavation, I hope.
This was actually an artifact from one of the shovel test pits. This is a shirt of pottery that's actually of Native American manufacture. This is a type of pottery that's been called Appalachie red.
The earliest we're down right now is mid-19th century, mid-1800s, but we are finding evidence of the ice cream parlor and flower market that was here in that early antebellum period and late antebellum period. We're also finding what looks to be activities associated with the public park aspect, picnics, possibly a campfire or barbecue. The other thing we didn't expect was a very high number of toys. We're getting lots of late 19th century marbles and a couple of Victorian porcelain doll parts. We're finding out lots of things about human behavior.
We're taking samples to collect little items called phytoliths. They're very small, microscopically sized mineral bodies. They are very useful to archaeologists because they preserve extremely well. Grasses have a lot of phytoliths, so we can get some idea of what the environmental conditions were like based on the composition of the phytolith assemblage.
In the excavation unit that I've been working on, at the very bottom of it, down in the clay subsoil, we found remains of what may be the earliest structure yet excavated in the French Quarter. The building is set off from the existing street grid. It's at a strange angle, which helps us to identify it as possibly being from this earliest period.
We know that we found a small temporary structure, definitely built by the French, not Native Americans, because the post hole is square. The walls are simply two planks pressed into the ground, very temporary, probably wouldn't have lasted more than a year or two. We've uncovered the earliest structure that's ever been found archaeologically in New Orleans.
I'm delighted that this story is really starting to take shape. The most helpful part was the archaeological part, because it went back very early, back even to the site before the city in some ways. It builds up a longer story of the site. For the plant story, I went mainly to America, but only Native American plants, adding a few of the plants which were introduced by the European people, fruit trees. The fruit trees I choose are not necessarily European trees, but trees which have been growing in Europe at the period of the settlers coming here. I'm using rather ordinary trees for here, but which are really significant of that place we love and which were introduced to Europe, and it makes really the link in between the two stories. I went back to a formal pattern. The American plants are really the surrounding, and the center, to create a design, will be a difference of mowing, having a lower part in the center, in the cross shape, and a little bit raised grass in the surrounding. To get a better vision of that axis, I'd love to be able to sunken a bit the monument dedicated to the French sailors. That little bit of stone being close to you is hiding the total length of the grass you see in between that monument and the Christ. Keeping the possibility of using that wonderful space in the center in the art of the city is very important on a living point of view, on a human point of view. Everything has been a help. Every minute of the work of anyone in that story has been a help to add things which will be a visual and tomorrow's connection with the past.
We're still here, we're still beating, we're still kicking. New Orleanians are more resilient than anybody in the whole world.